Hello, and welcome to the second of 8 presentations in the 2021 Great Decisions Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes, and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events, information on joining a Great Decisions group, and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. For decades, the annual Great Decisions Briefing Book has framed informed civil discussions about critical international issues. Groups around the country, including here in the Kansas City metro area, meet in coffee shops, conference rooms, and now virtually to explore these issues together and distill policy recommendations and future outlooks. To support their exploration and to bring the larger community into the discussion, the International Relations Council is proud to offer a series of conversations with respected experts through 2021 on the year's 8 Great Decisions topics. We warmly welcome diverse perspectives and invite your engagement with these foreign policy issues from work, from home, or wherever you might be. We hope you'll engage that way with us this evening as we explore Brexit and the European Union. We know that many in the audience have already discussed this topic with their local Great Decisions group, so we certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the recording of this conversation, as well as other conversations in the Great Decisions Lecture Series, as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming months. We're very grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Great Decisions Lecture Series possible. In particular, sustaining series sponsor Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White, and supporting series sponsor Nancy C. Messer. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. In addition to being a member of the IRC Board of Directors, Stephen Steigman is Director of 91.9 Classical KC and Chief of Broadcast Operations for KCUR 89.3, the NPR affiliate in Kansas City. Previously, he served as the founding producer of the award-winning public affairs program Up to Date with Steve Kraske. Stephen holds a BA in Arts Administration from Skidmore College and an MPA degree from the Block School of Management at UMKC, and I know that he can't wait to get out and travel again. Stephen, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and greetings, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're delighted to have you along, and I hope that you'll learn a lot this evening and ask some great questions. Allow me to introduce our guest this evening, Daniel Hamilton. He's the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Global Europe Program at the Wilson Center. He is a widely recognized expert on U.S. foreign policy and on European, Eurasian, and transatlantic security, economic, and political affairs. He's quoted frequently in major U.S., European, and global media and has testified on numerous occasions before committees of the U.S. Congress and European parliaments. He is also senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins SAIS, where he co-leads the school's postdoctoral program on the United States, Europe, and World Order. He was the founding director of the SAIS Center for Transatlantic Relations, and for 15 years served concurrently as executive director of the American Consortium for European Union Studies. It's a pleasure to welcome here this evening. Dan, thanks for joining us this evening. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be with you virtually in Kansas City. I was telling Stephen and others, I went to high school and junior high in St. Louis, so I spent a lot of time in Missouri, and we had the good fortune of being with Secretary Albright a couple of years ago at the Harry Truman Library in Independence. We released a book together there, and we had a wonderful excursion at the World War I Museum. It was a great time, and I remember that fondly as well. I was asked to talk tonight about Brexit, the never-ending story, and the European Union and what that might all mean. And it seems to go on forever. It's like the Energizer Bunny going on and on and on. But you know, things keep developing, and it's probably important to keep up on it. So let me give you kind of my take on it. You know, the United Kingdom, you know, actually left the European Union on January 31st, 2020, but they had an 11-month transition period, and they were negotiating a final kind of trade agreement so that the UK finally left. The real departure, the real divorce, if you will, started just in January 1st of this year. You know, Brexit is really a defining moment for Britain's relations with the rest of Europe, but even perhaps for its future as a united kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, what they call the devolved nations that make up the UK. It's going to affect our relations with the UK as well, and with many, many other countries. And of course, it's going to affect the European Union and its future. So, you know, so why did this happen? Why did one of the major countries within the European Union decide it had to leave? It's good to probably remember that the UK, you know, was a latecomer in some regards to the European Union. It didn't really join at the beginning. France kept it away for some years as well. And when it finally did join, it never kind of sat right, it seemed. It was questioned whether Britain was ever really comfortable in the EU. And on the surface, a few issues in recent years have sort of led UK public opinion to turn more critical. There have been lots of debates about how the UK was paying into the EU fund. Margaret Thatcher, you know, started that by said, you know, I want my money back, and there was a lot of bitterness about how much the UK was paying. She arranged actually you know, a rebate for the UK during that time, but there, you know, it's always about money, as I'm sure we all are aware. Then the Europeans decided to create the Eurozone and the European currency, the euro, and the pound sterling really wasn't part of that. It was kind of now something different, and that was also a bit disjointed. When the EU enlarged to take in lots of new countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, they also opened up the free movement provisions of the EU treaties, free movement of people across the entire EU space. And a lot of those from poor EU countries in Eastern Europe went straight to the UK to look for work. And they had a huge inflow of migrants, and that created some tensions. And then I think in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, there was a real upsurge in, you know, identity politics in Europe, including sort of, you know, England thinking of itself as an entity rather than the UK. And I think behind these kind of more immediate issues, there was just the fading of historical memory. You know, First and Second World Wars had faded. The importance of maintaining a kind of a structure of peace and interdependence in Europe started to diminish in terms of its importance, which had been so important to the post-war generation. Communism was no longer a threat. So England's self-image, I think, played a role in this. Its discomfort with the EU, because it's always seen itself as sort of a, you know, a fortress that nature has built for itself on an island, surrounding by the seas that it could control. So the goal of the negotiators was to get their sovereignty back, to not have decisions made in Brussels for them, but only the Westminster Parliament should be the ultimate arbiter of British destiny. So to fast forward, on Christmas Eve, our last Christmas Eve, the UK and the EU concluded a trade and cooperation agreement about their trading relationship. And it provides for tariff quota-free trade in goods between the two sides and a better deal than the EU has offered any other advanced economy in the world. The price for it was the UK's agreement not to undercut EU standards, labor, environmental, other kinds of standards. And so that was all they left with, really, was just a trade deal. They hadn't settled on lots of other things that are still up in the air in terms of how this relationship will work. But now the goods trade across the English Channel faces this hard border, a regulatory border, a customs border. Firms from each side can't assume they can just sell their goods in the other's market. There's a lot of red tape. One law firm said it would cost British business about 23 billion a year, just the extra red tape. And EU business is about 19 billion, just more forms they have to fill out that they didn't have to before because it was all free flow of goods. And so I think, the tensions at the border you've seen in the last few months have been not good. And they're probably going to get worse before they get better, because there were a lot of grace periods on some of these customs and checks and everything, and they're all ending. So if you look at what's happened just in the 3 months, 4 months since the UK left the EU, UK trade has dropped about 11% overall, and that was on top of a 10% hit to trade before the referendum, before it left the single market. So, there's been a real drop in sort of the economic commercial relations between the UK and the EU. The real sticking point part of the deal was about Northern Ireland. For those of you maybe not always, tracking all the geography, Northern Ireland is on the island of Ireland, but it's actually part of the United Kingdom. And so the deal was to not create a hard border on the island of Ireland, because when they were all in the EU, you could go from Ireland into Northern Ireland with no problem, no checks. But now there's, what do? Do you create a new border? That's probably not a good idea because of conflict that's happened in Northern Ireland in recent decades. But if you put a good check on goods going from Britain to Northern Ireland, you're creating a customs border in the middle of the Irish Sea. And that's sort of where we are right now. The deal is that the Northern Ireland is sort of adhering to EU rules, but before stuff comes over to the island, the other island of the UK, they have to get checked somehow. And how that's going to happen is still unresolved. So it's just, frankly, chaos. And that's creating a real political minefield because neither side wants to give in. If you saw in the news recently about fisheries, everybody's angry about fish. They're having a fish war with the French now about who gets to trawl in whose waters. They even sent the Royal Navy out to protect them. This almost seems silly, except that this is really the heart of what is happening now between the UK and the EU. The other part of the deal is that the movement of people has been constrained. So if you're a Brit, you don't have the right now to go to any other EU country or live there like others did. A lot of British citizens have retired in Southern Europe, thinking they were just part of the EU, and now they're finding they don't even know what their status is anymore. And the same for EU citizens; they don't have the right to go to the UK anymore. And there are all sorts of visa waiver arrangements and everything. If you're a doctor, you've lost your ability to automatically work in the EU, or an engineer, an architect, your qualifications aren't necessarily recognized. And the trade deal didn't even address trade and services, which is about 80% of the British economy. The UK is essentially a services economy, and the deal didn't even talk about that. And that's been a big problem because of the financial role of the City of London. They've lost access to the EU single market. And there's been a huge shift of money out of the UK, actually to New York, but also to places like Amsterdam, which has now surpassed London as in some kinds of trading activities. And that's creating a lot of tension, of course, too, about the future of the UK. There's a lot of estimates of thousands of jobs being lost, although many are being created too. So it's hard to know exactly what that'll be. It's important probably to remember that the United Kingdom really remains Europe's main financial center, and it's really a global, financial center. It's about 43% of the turnover in the foreign exchange market. And the UK is the primary investment center in Europe, the second largest in the world after the United States. But if you add the problems of the pandemic and the sort of recession that's hit, both sides of the English Channel, all the economies in Europe are really struggling to come up. The United States is kind of roaring back in growth, but in Europe, they slipped again into recession in the first quarter of this year, and they're coming out of it, but it's going to be a while. A lot of people are wondering, well, what's this mean about the other parts of the UK? Scotland. Scotland, is part of the UK, but they have their own sort of self-rule in many ways. And they just had an election a couple of weeks ago, May 6th, in which the Scottish National Party, the sort of the Independence Party, got just one seat less short of a majority, but they forming a coalition right now with the Greens, so they will have a majority. And they are declaring they're going to have a new referendum on independence from the United Kingdom. And so they had if you recall, they had a referendum in 2014. It failed. About 55% of people voted against it. But that's because the reason they voted against it was because they wanted to stay in the European Union. Independent Scotland would not have been part of the European Union. But now, independent Scotland probably has a chance to become part of the European Union rather than stay with the United Kingdom. So the whole calculus from that earlier referendum now has been turned on its head. The problem is that the Prime Minister of the UK has to approve having a referendum. And Boris Johnson has said he's not going to do that. So there's more tension there. The pandemic, again, is focusing people's minds elsewhere, but I would suggest within the next couple of years, you're going to see another real push for Scottish independence. And we'll have to watch that space. If they did that, they would apply probably right away to be a member of the European Union, which would take, and then again, some years, but that's what they're accustomed to. And it would really question sort of the role of the UK, even its existence. It has some ripple effects in other parts of Europe. If you think of Catalonia and Spain, or the Balkans, a number of countries that, their territories aren't exactly clear. They're watching what happens in Scotland pretty carefully. So we'll see about that. The other, as I mentioned, the real problem here is Northern Ireland and Ireland. If you recall your history, there was real conflict, violence in Northern Ireland in the 60s through the 90s, torn apart between people who were loyal to having Northern Ireland part of the UK and those who wanted to join Ireland as a country. And those divisions split also down religious lines, Protestants and Catholics. And so it was very violent. It was a bad time. It was really only in 1998, actually, US Senator George Mitchell brokered a peace agreement called the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, which has given the United States a stake in the peace there. And there's been a lot of concern that the way Brexit is happening could threaten the Good Friday Agreement. And that's an interesting dynamic now. You see many US politicians of both parties warning the British, warning Boris Johnson, don't fool with the Good Friday Agreement. And that is leading to some real issues in the US-UK relationship. So what about US-UK? The other thing that has happened over the last couple of years is the Trump administration is negotiating a trade agreement with the UK to have a bilateral agreement. And they were close to done by the time the Trump administration ended, but they weren't quite done. And what you see is that President Biden isn't making trade deals much of a priority. He says, you know, we have to get back on our feet first. I'm not going to do trade deals until we know the American worker, you know, is back on his feet or her feet. And the pandemic, of course, is taking much higher priority. The other problem on our side is that what's called Trade Promotion Authority, the Congress delegates authority to the executive branch to negotiate trade agreements. That's expiring in July 1st. And so the Congress is going to have to renew that, which will take, again, months, frankly. So I don't see this happening anytime soon. And in the UK, you see some nervousness about a trade deal with the United States, especially on agriculture. If you can imagine, British farmers were getting subsidies for the European Union for decades. Suddenly that stopped, and then they're going to open up their agricultural market to the United States. You can imagine some of the concerns that the British farmers have. So if you think about going forward now, the UK has done something interesting also recently. They released what they call the integrated review. It's a review of their foreign policy, defense policy, trying to establish now what they call global Britain, a new role for the UK in the world. And what's interesting about this review is they underscore, for a foreign policy, defense policy document, science and technology. Innovation economy is the basis for Britain, global Britain. And lots of money going to be pumped into, maintaining the competitiveness of the British economy. They say they will devote more attention now to NATO and less to the EU. In fact, the document is striking how little it says about the EU, even though that's all we're talking about. It's interesting to recall, perhaps, British forces are in the Baltic states defending forward in NATO. So most British officials are really turning their attention to NATO as sort of the way the UK will engage in Europe. But the other signal of that document was what they call a tilt, quote, a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. It's not the pivot that the US has used to talk about pivoting to the Asia Pacific, but they call it a tilt, which means they're going to devote a lot more attention to that part of the world, which is an interesting element. They're also spending more on their nuclear forces, revising and modernizing nuclear forces, which is an interesting thing that, and prioritizing cyber defense. So people ask, so what's the impact on the EU? I think what's been striking is, in the short term, the shock of Brexit sort of solidified the unity of the 27 EU member states, that they weren't going to let this, unravel the EU with others leaving. But I think if you look over the horizon, you can see some other potential challenges. France is going to have an election next year about this time. And President Macron is under real challenge from anti-European French nationalist, far-right party headed by Marine Le Pen. She lost to him last time, but she's doing well in the polls. And if France was a founding member of the EU, would question its European role, that would be something. I think what Brexit has mainly done in Europe is to shatter a mindset that had been gathered over decades, that this process of European integration would just continue automatically. What they call ever closer union would just continue to happen. And now that premise, I think, has been shattered, and it's not exactly clear where we'll go. If I thought about it as an American, I think however it goes, it's in our interest as a country to make sure each part of what I call the three-legged stool, so US, UK, UK, EU, EU, US, that all three legs remain sturdy. And it's not just about our security, which it is, but it's also about understanding the dense economic relationships we have with each other, which are the densest in the world, bar none. The US-UK, economic relationship accounts for about almost 3 million jobs in the United States and the UK. $1.3 trillion of investment flowing across the country, 130 billion in goods and services, the same in services. But we have to remember the EU is much more important to the UK in terms of economics than is the United States. And frankly, the EU is much more important to the United States than the UK is in terms of job, trade, investment. Our commercial relationship with the EU is 6 million jobs, $4.5 trillion of investment, 700 billion worth of goods, and another 350 billion worth of services. So it's far more significant to our interests. And that's why we don't want to make this a competitive thing. We should make sure our partners, most of which are our allies, should figure this out. And if I brought it home, and just to conclude, why we care, it cares at home. I do a study every year on the transatlantic economy, so I have actually the job numbers, and I can tell you, Missouri and Kansas each export 4 times more to Europe than to China. We like to talk about China, but Europe is our major economic partner. European investment is really significant in both of your states. We'd like to talk about offshore jobs, but there's also something called onshore jobs. It's when foreign investment comes to your state and creates jobs, and companies sell products and services from Missouri or Kansas. As far as I can tell, 90,000 jobs in Missouri are directly dependent on European investment. And if you add in all of the trade and services and distributors and suppliers, it's probably about 270,000 jobs in Missouri are dependent on a healthy, European relationship. And in Kansas, smaller relationship, but still significant, about 38,000 jobs, maybe 100,000 jobs in total that are important, that we get this three-legged stool right. So let me stop there. I'm happy to have any discussion and questions and whatever you'd like to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thanks so very much, Dan. I really appreciate those words, and it's great, your great expertise in this area. As we see some questions start to come in, let me remind our attendees that there is an open forum here. You can toss your questions into the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And as some of those are coming in, allow me to talk a little bit more kind of about this three-legged stool here. How does the U.S. balance relationships between the UK and the EU moving forward? I mean, does our countries, does the U.S.'s special relationship with the UK outweigh its connection with Europe?
I don't think so. I think we have a special relationship with the UK, but it's not uniquely special. We have, obviously, France is our oldest ally, frankly. Maybe our most difficult one, but it's our oldest one. In fact, they were our ally against the British, if we want to remember that.
Go that far back, right?
Yeah.
There's a musical about that, isn't there?
Yeah. I think one way to frame it is, again, just go back to NATO. We are all allies. There's a huge overlap of countries in the EU that are in NATO. The UK didn't leave NATO, and the US is in NATO. It's not in the EU. I like to say, for people wondering about the EU, because I realize it's hard to understand it sometimes, it's the most important organization in the world to which the United States does not belong. So like it, don't like it, we better know something about it. And as I said, because of the economic relationships and our security relationships, it is a primary partner. So we don't want to, be caught in this either or kind of false choice. Our job, it seems to me, is make sure they sort of get it right. That's been America at its best in Europe has been a European power in which we are part of all of the debates and trying to get people to, move along and not go back to the tragedies of history. So I think that's now our role once again. If you think about it, on many issues, I don't see where we would not want the UK to be involved with the US and the EU and vice versa. If you think about the whole effort on energy transition, climate change, all of that, the UK is hosting the G7 next month. It's a huge partner of the United States on these issues, but so is the EU. We agree on most of those things at the moment. If you think about the digital revolution and all the things that we have to cope with in terms of cyberspace, think about the disruption that happened on the East Coast with energy networks recently, or the solar winds attacks. These are other, countries and groups that are trying to disrupt open societies. We all share across the Atlantic an interest in stopping that and figuring out how to be more resilient together. So despite whatever groupings we're in, I don't think that should prevent us from working together on the kinds of issues that I'm talking about.
Well, you mentioned the big C word a little bit earlier when talking about China. I'm wondering how China views Brexit and how do they view the overall situation, and China and other international countries certainly. And what moves have other countries made to position themselves for for optimal outcomes, really?
Well, China is interesting because it has tried to use the EU as a sort of a wedge to kind of split the Europeans off from the United States when it suits its interests. But so, for instance, the EU and China concluded a investment agreement last December, just before the Biden administration came into office, even though the Biden administration said, can you wait a few weeks so we can get our acts together? So instead of sending Washington a message, yes, we can work on that, they sent Beijing a message that they can, split the Europeans from the Americans. So that was an unfortunate, I think, effort. And Beijing, pocketed the political gain from that agreement, and the commercial gain from it, in my view, is low. But what's happened since then is we did get together and decided Chinese, actions against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and Hong Kong warrant some response. So we had a coordinated set of sanctions: US, EU, UK, Canada, number of countries, all at the same time sanctioning China. So we did come back on that. And what the Chinese did, they had counter sanctions against the European Parliament and against the very members of that parliament that are going to have to ratify this investment agreement. So clearly it wasn't of much interest to them. And when its value to them vanished, so did their interest in the EU. So it's a tactical thing. They have made strategic investments in certain EU member states to try to, create some divisions, and they're good at trying to do that. So, the Russians, frankly, do a good job of that as well.
In just a couple of minutes, I want to get back to our conversation about Ireland and Northern Ireland and what might happen there. But first, I want to ask you, you had mentioned earlier that if anything, Brexit really brought the European Union kind of a little bit, the other members of the European Union, a little bit closer together in lockstep. And I'm wondering what that means for the future of the EU. Is the EU likely to take some steps to make it more difficult for other countries to leave? And is there some legitimate concern about the possible unraveling of the European Union?
Well, as I say, I think this assumption that somehow there was ever closer union, that European integration, the great experiment of European integration was just on kind of an automatic pilot, has been questioned. That's really a big, big perspective change for many in Europe. And if you add all of the other issues that has happened, for about 30 years after the Cold War ended, I think in Europe there was a paradigm that kind of captured the mindset that somehow it was an ever expanding Western-led order that's magnetic, that's attracting ever new countries to join it across the, further east you go, countries are joining it, that there would even be a place for somehow for Russia in that. That was sort of the mindset at some point. And that you were creating this space in Europe of democracy, market economies where war simply didn't happen. It was a very nice, image. But I think some of the premises of that were shattered. The idea that, there is no more use of military power. Mr. Putin disabused the Europeans of that when he first intervened in Georgia in 2008 and then annexed Crimea and intervened militarily in eastern Ukraine. There's still a war going on right there. The idea you can change borders by force in Europe. Hard power does matter. And Russia's not somehow lost along the way to the European nirvana. It's going its own way. I think that's shaken a lot of unspoken assumptions in Europe about their future. If you look at the migration crisis that happened, which is still, but could happen again easily, I think that shook a lot of faith in the Europe of institutions that they could deal with, waves of humanity. And they realized, they really couldn't. They weren't prepared for that. They created a whole backlash of politics that are still, still pretty rife. And so, President Macron, he talks about Europe's new vocation being a Europe that protects. That's what he likes to say. If you really are cynical about it, it seems to be it's a Europe that protects some Europeans from other Europeans. And so the appetite for further enlargement to other countries just isn't there right now. And so it's a challenge, I think, in terms of these kind of things that are pulling the Europeans apart. It's not the stable Europe that we had thought. I think that how you think about Europe right now turns to me on the question, do you think it's a stable continent or a fragile continent? I would argue it's more fragile than we tend to acknowledge.
You used the term, I think, border conflict just a few moments ago, and I wanted to get back to Ireland and Scotland. We have a question here from Paul Nugent. It's a little bit long, so let me do my best here to paraphrase. Do you think that civil war on the island of Ireland is a likely or possible outcome of Brexit? His question is based on the following. In the weeks after the Brexit vote in 2016, Gerry Adams published an op-ed in the New York Times arguing that Brexit would lead to a united Ireland. The majority of the people in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU. One way to do that would be to abandon the UK and join the Republic of Ireland, as you mentioned. If this happens and it requires only a slim majority in the North to agree to it, a united Ireland may be realized after 100 years of partition, but it could mean a significant minority in the North, hardline unionists, taking up arms to defend their links to England. So troubles may return, but this time driven by unionist paramilitaries fighting the Irish police and army, which has had little or no experience dealing with insurgent groups. And by the way, he says, in full disclosure, I was born and raised in the Republic, calling in from Connecticut. So his follow-up question, if I may, would the Biden administration be willing to support Ireland if the scenario above came to pass? And would it be willing to stand up to the Boris Johnson administration on this matter by withholding preferential trade deals?
Yeah. Well, I think I can't speak for the Biden administration. These are my personal views, but the Biden administration plus the Trump administration plus Republicans and Democrats in Congress have disabused the British Prime Minister of the notion that they're going to get a trade deal if they fool around with the Good Friday Agreement. So that's already there. And the Good Friday Agreement kind of goes to the heart of this question, it seems to me, because in the Good Friday Agreement, there is a provision that you could have a vote, a referendum on Irish unity, if you will, if the British Secretary of State determines that there is a majority for it. It seems that there is a majority for it. So it's a rather odd phrasing that somehow the UK minister gets to decide when the timing of a something like that would be, even though it implies big change for the Republic of Ireland. And so you know, this is the scenario that I think the questioner is relating to, that if somebody decided, yes, we could have a vote on that, and they won it by a slim majority, but it was a majority, then, you know, there would be a process probably underway to think about how to unify the island. But you would end up with the scenario that if it's a slim majority, it means people violently opposed to it would probably, you know, could take recourse to arms. So I think the U.S. position is what it is right now. Let's not fool with the Good Friday Agreement. And I was struck, a friend of mine is actually the former Irish Prime Minister, John Bruton. He just wrote a piece for me, which if you want to read it, go to the Wilson Center website. It was just released a couple days ago on this very point. So he, as a former Prime Minister of Ireland, has said, let's not rush this. We should only have a referendum on unity if we really are sure everybody wants it. Let's not just force it, because that's the problem. That would create the problem. Let's let politics come into its own, and we're not there yet. So his advice was extreme caution on that point, because I think he fears what the questioner is implying.
Here's the question, and it goes back to your words about Scotland and its recent election. If the Scots were to vote to leave the UK and to join the EU, would they simply be able to do that through a referendum, or are there additional steps?
Well, they could, within the UK, they can do that. You know, they have their own parliament in Scotland. And it you know, actually, you know, many laws, many things governing Scottish life are done that way. They're not done in Westminster in London. But on this one point, as I mentioned, the British Prime Minister has to say you can have a referendum. And if you have the referendum, it would be, you know, Brexit all over again, guess up in the other direction. So you would have to, you know, negotiate the provisions of that, what that would be. That would take a few years, just like we've seen now. And then Scotland would be independent, which means it would have to start from scratch in a way in terms of its relationship with the European Union. It would have to apply for membership as a new candidate country. Well, since it's been a member in a way, it probably, you know, wouldn't take that long, but it hasn't been an independent country. So that part about it would probably delay it even more. So it would be, you know, I said no exit from Brexit. We would have no exit from the Scottish referendum if that happens too. But it is a plausible, absolutely a plausible scenario.
We haven't talked about Wales. What about little Wales? They're no threat, are they?
Well, again, this is like a dominoes. You know, if somehow the impression in Wales is that Northern Ireland is going a new way, Scotland's going a new way, kind of just leaves them there, and it's hard to know what they would think. But I think the notion that, you know, if the British Prime Minister basically said you cannot have a referendum to the Scots, what is it? What is the message? The message is we are forcing you in this union. This is a union of compulsion, not of free will, and that will have a lot of ripple effects in other parts of the United Kingdom, including Wales.
Let's hop back over to Ireland. There's a question here from Jane who asks, what's happening right now with the border with Northern Ireland, since nothing has really worked out? For example, is there a border if you're driving?
No, they made sure that they didn't do that. the question of the border is once you try to get from Northern Ireland into the other island on the UK side, it's all UK territory. And so this is the strange deal. Northern Ireland is still adhering to EU rules. And so there's no border, but it's not in the EU. And so at some point there has to be some place where UK law and EU law stop and meet each other. And they're trying to put that in the middle of the Irish Sea rather than on a land border. And this is where the problem is, because they're not actually implementing that. So the EU is getting upset because they're saying, this is the problem. You have to adhere to our rules then.
Mm-hmm.
And the UK said the whole point of Brexit is so we don't have to adhere to your rules. But so you have this odd situation right now that the UK has asserted greater sovereignty for itself while accepting less sovereignty over Northern Ireland because of it's part of the EU now, still in a way. It's an odd situation, and it's murky, and there are no real, definitive agreements, and they're each accusing each other of violating, everything you can think about right now.
Just a reminder to our attendees today that if you have a question or a comment that you'd like us to address with Dan Hamilton, you can toss it into the Q&A box on your screen. We'd like to see what you have to say. Karen Beth writes, looking at Russia, how do we work with the UK and EU, and where do we diverge?
Well, the UK and the US, I think, are pretty close on assessments of Russia. The one place where I think we might have some issue has to do with corruption and the role of the City of London and financial flows coming from Russia. The oligarchs who are basically using the City of London as a place to, funnel their money. And that's been a problem. There's been a lot of investigative, journalists who have uncovered what they call the London laundromat in terms of where this is going. And so that's problematic, I think. Not to say that, other Western countries, including the United States, aren't susceptible to the same thing, but there's a particular Russian flow of money and potential influence there that is probably of some concern. But on the NATO front, on UK-Russia relations are bad. If you remember the poisonings, all sorts of things that have happened there. UK is quite tough on Russia on the cyber, attacks and so on. They're very much aligned. And so I think there, again, our approach is through NATO. NATO is pretty strong on Russia these days. And so I don't see a huge, divergence there. When it comes to the EU and Russia, though, then it's a somewhat different thing because some of the commercial considerations come into play. And there, it's the EU has had a bad patch with Russia too. The foreign minister, the EU high representative, the foreign minister, if you will, Joseph Borrell, went to Moscow and was embarrassed in public by Sergei Lavrov, who basically said the EU is just an awful little creature and we don't want to deal with it. And while they're having the press conference, Russia expelled EU diplomats without telling him. So that didn't go too well. He was embarrassed. And so, Russian cyber attacks and disinformation tactics all through many EU countries have also created a real problem here. So I don't think we're so disaligned on Russia as we had been in some other times. And it's China that I think is still creating some, we're not quite in sync on a lot of China issues, and that's a somewhat different topic.
We have this question. Is the EU visa requirement for US citizens really going to start next year? Any thoughts?
I think that's all, as far as I know, I haven't kept on it, the pandemic has thrown all of that just kind of like, After talking about visa requirements, this summer they're desperate to have American tourists come. So they're very welcoming right now because we're vaccinated, and they would love to have some rich Americans, help their economy. So we actually have a travel ban still on the Schengen zone, on the zone of movement within the EU. So that's a problem. Although we started up visa processing, if you can get a J1 or other kind of visa to come to the United States as a European, you can get in. So it'll be gradual. It's really chaotic in terms of knowing the regulations from one day to another. There's this whole discussion of vaccine passports, if you know, and that's the EU is going to create a vaccine passport, but many EU member states have now just kind of rushed ahead with their own deals, like the tourism countries in Southern Europe, Greece, and so on. They are desperate. So I'm not sure that that's happening. So it just creates lots of confusion, I think, for Americans trying to travel. The visa requirement was in part because the US was not extending full visa free provisions to some EU member states. Poland, for instance, because what the record of Poles coming to America, many of them didn't go back and vanished. And there's thresholds the Justice Department have about countries that have people come and then they don't go home. But they resolved that with Poland and some of the other EU countries. And so, as to my knowledge, that's become less of an issue. And it could be that that visa thing just kind of melts away now that we're in a really very different situation.
Well, speaking of the desire to pump up economies, tourism economies in Europe, I want to ask you a little bit about currency and value. The UK was never on, never used the euro, but what impact has Brexit had on the euro, if any?
Well, I don't know on the euro per se. I mean, the euro's doing fine, and it is the second reserve currency in the world after the dollar. There is, they treat it as a very strong currency, and it's in terms of the EU being a major trader and investor, it is used on transactions. And as I said, the immediate impact of Brexit was to transfer a lot of financial operations to parts of the EU away from London, like Amsterdam. So it didn't necessarily affect the EU the euro as euro, but it has affected parts of the Eurozone to their advantage and to London's disadvantage. And you've seen that over actually, I track this, over the last few decades, U.S. companies increasingly not investing in the UK, but investing in places like the Netherlands and other places because they're in the Eurozone and they want to be in the Eurozone. And the enlargement of the EU to Eastern Europe also prompted a lot of U.S. companies to want to be in that, continental Europe because they were part of a bigger single market and easier to access. Poland's an interesting story. When the Cold War ended, when the wall came down, basically zero American investment in Poland. Now it's huge. I think American companies employ about 250,000 Poles directly, and without even talking about trade or anything. And much of that has come at the expense of the UK and France in terms of manufacturing operations of U.S. companies. So it's not the euro per se, but there's a shift that's going on commercially to more the center of Europe and not the UK.
Well, allow me to end on ask my last question, and kind of a very simple one. Ha ha ha. Administrations change, administrations change, opinions change, and we're just beginning to see what's happening now that the UK has really begun that exit from the EU. Is there a future possibility of an exit from Brexit?
on the part of the UK. Are they ever able to rejoin the EU?
I think that they wanted to rejoin, the EU would welcome it, although the emotions are a little raw at the moment. But it's one of these things. You go through the experience, and it could be the UK comes out on the other end of the experience and says, that wasn't good for us. There are a lot of global developments that could affect that too. The UK's role, this global Britain concept of Boris Johnson, we'll see. How big of a global Britain there is, and in terms of the kind of world we're facing with China and other countries. So it's hard to know, but I mean, the basic principle that I think you're talking about is, yes, they can come back if they wanted to. The EU would probably want them in. The UK has been a major member of the EU. It's given it huge strength and resources and talent and creativity, and I think the basic EU response to Brexit has been sadness. They've been sad about the whole thing. You can just tell it.
Yeah. Well, Daniel Hamilton, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us this evening. And my thanks to our audience for sharing their questions and their time with us as well. And allow me to hand it back over to IRC Executive Director, Matthew Hughes. Matthew.
We're 12 months, 13 months into a pandemic, and I still stay on mute without meaning to. Dan Hamilton, thank you so much for your insights and your perspectives this evening. This is a topic that we've been dealing with for a number of years now. We will, it seems, likely be dealing with the repercussions for a while longer. So we'll keep you on speed dial and appreciate any further insight you can give us. Thank you so much. And Stephen, thank you again to IRC members and friends who joined us from around the country tonight, and those who will watch this recording later on. Thank you for the meaningful ways that you engage with these conversations that matter. We'll look forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.